Welcome, everybody. I see a few folks who are early birds joining us. Our program is going to get started at 7. If you are here for the Shared Voices Town Hall on Policing, you are in the right place. We have a great program planned. There are going to be several ways for you to participate this evening. You can participate using the chat here in Zoom, or you can also go to slido.com with the hashtag policing, and you will be able to participate in the polls and the Q&A through that platform. So welcome, everyone. We're going to get started right at 7 o'clock. Good to see you. Hi, good evening, everybody. Welcome to the Shared Voices Town Hall on Community, Race, and Policing. We are going to get started in just a minute. Just want to let everybody know we have a way for you to participate. You can enter in comments through Zoom. You can also go to slido.com and post questions using the Q&A tab, or when we are launching the polls, add your perspective to the different questions that we have. So we'll get started in just a minute. We're going to get ready to launch on Facebook. So welcome, everybody.
Okay.
We are just getting ready to launch on Facebook Live.
Are we all set?
Yes, I think so. Okay, let's see. Oops. Oh, no. Okay, no, I'm having a technical issue. Okay.
Well,
Okay, well, I think we should go ahead and get started, and we'll launch on Facebook Live when we have the technical issue resolved. But for now, why don't we go ahead and start the program? So, Chris and Matt, would you like to begin?
Sure, we'll do. Good evening, everyone. I'm Chris Lewis, partnered with my friend Matt Harris here, and we're going to be serving as moderators for this community town hall. So thank you everyone for joining. We're seeing the attendees list tick up, and hopefully for folks who are able to join us on Facebook, we'll have that up and running soon. But we're going to go ahead and get started. We've got 90 minutes here of community conversation, and this is the second in a series that we've started to do that many community members have come together to organize. The Shared Voices group that organized the initial town hall, virtual town hall in June, where over 1,000 people joined to talk about racial justice issues. And we had a broad, wide-ranging conversation. And with this town hall and hopefully other ones in the future, we hope to zero in on specific topics. And so for this one, our goal is to talk about policing in the city of Alexandria. And so we want to thank everyone for joining us. And what we'd like to do to get started is first do a couple acknowledgements, but the first one we'd like to do is really to take a moment, since we lost some real heroes in the past week in the racial justice movement. We'd love to take a moment of silence for the loss of Congressman John Lewis and C.T. Vivian, who hopefully everyone has gotten to know. If you didn't know their legacy, you know, all of these conversations that we are free to have, you know, to try to make our community better, you know, here in 2020, we all stand on the shoulders of men like these and men and women who are nameless, but who were active in the movement for racial justice over the last century and beyond. So if you would just join with us for a moment of silence, please. Thank you. So now that we've acknowledged those on whose shoulders we stand, we'd also like to acknowledge a few folks who have helped put the Shared Voices town halls together. Matt and I are very lucky to serve as moderators, but there's a whole team of folks who've been meeting. This is really a partnership between community members, the nonprofit community, as well as our wonderful partners at Act for Alexandria, who provided the backbone technology, and even folks from the City of Alexandria government. So just want to acknowledge a few of them who've put in work. We've got first from the community helping us monitor conversation online on Facebook Live and on Zoom. Amy and Jackie and Jean and Michelle and Gal, we really appreciate all your help in helping us come up with questions and organizing the structure for this, and monitoring social media with this tonight. In addition to that, there's the three folks who've really been the backbone of the Shared Voices team from the start of it. We've got Heather Peeler, the president of Act for Alexandria, our community foundation here in the city. We've got Jacqueline Tucker, who works as our first and new racial equity director with the City of Alexandria government, as well as Eric King, the head of the CYEP program here in the city, working with young men and improving their lives. They have been great leaders, and we want to thank you guys for organizing this and other conversations in the city and ongoing conversations. So thank you all for putting in your time on this. I think I got everyone. Oh, you know, I did leave out a few folks. The Act for Alexandria team and staff are awesome. Brandy Yee, the program director there, who's working behind the scenes, getting everything set up. Sophia Hill, who's been working as an intern this summer. and the rest of the Act for Alexandria team as well. Just has been tremendous. Thank you all for all the work you've been doing. And with that, let's see if there's any other, no, I think those are all the acknowledgements that I had.
Okay.
Matt?
Yeah, thank you, Chris. And I want to echo Chris's sentiments and thank all of the people who he mentioned. This is a great opportunity. I'm kind of an outsider. I was not with Act for Alexandria before, and I've got to commend them for doing a wonderful professional job in helping our community grow and develop and make policy easier for us to all see as citizens in this community. I want to also provide a little bit of context for today's program. One of the goals today of our conversation is to educate the public on the context of race and policing historically and then nationally, and then apply it to a conversation about Alexandria's specific needs and policies. As you know, City Council has come up with a resolution related to this topic, and we hope at the end of the day you'll be better informed. And if you are not better informed, we hope that you'll find links that are productive and helpful to you going forward. We're very lucky to have three distinguished panelists with us today. I can't thank them enough for their time and generosity. We've got Professor Brian Williams from the University of Virginia. We've got Linda Garcia, Policing Campaign Director at the Leadership Conference of Civil and Human Rights, and one of our own from the former police officer, Alexandria Resolutions and Committee Review Board, Bert Braunfeld, Director of Global Security and Safety / at the Visa Incorporated. So with that, we've always wanted this to be as interactive as possible for all of you out there. And there are a couple of ways for you to get involved directly in this conversation with us tonight. The first way is to share your comments via Zoom chat or Facebook Live comments. You can do that, submit your questions via Slido, which is an app that works with Zoom, and it aggregates the questions and you have the opportunity to vote on the questions. And then at the end, we will be participating in a poll that will be seen in real time, the results. If you go to the Slido app, or go to slido.com, #policing, you'll come right into our portal. So with that, we're going to do an initial survey. Chris, you want to take it from there? You're on mute.
See, I already failed with the mute button. All right, this will be a good initial test because you see here, Slido has the ability to do polling. And so we wanted to start with just one question. So if folks go into slido.com, if you haven't already, use policing as your code, the hashtag code. And in there we have a first question under the polls. And that question is, what is one word that describes your experience with Alexandria's police department? So if you guys are in Slido, we ask that you would enter one word and then enter it into, and then hit send. And then you should be able to see a word cloud start to populate. So please do that now. Think of one word that describes your experience with Alexandria's police department, and then press send in the Slido poll section. We're starting to see that populate. And we've got about 100 folks on the Zoom chat, or excuse me, on the Zoom interface, and maybe some others on Facebook. And right now we've got about 27, 28 responses. So we'll leave it open for a few more seconds. Hopefully folks are finding Slido easily enough. Again, it's www.slido.com. And then to get into our conversation, use policing, #policing as the code.
And one other thing, if I may, Chris, I don't know if you can see the code, the barcode on the upper corner. If you can take a picture of that, and you will automatically be directed to the website.
That's a great point. So we'll give this another 20 seconds. But as you see, when folks choose some of the same words, those words get bigger in the word cloud. So Some folks, we've seen the biggest word so far, minimal and none, professional, positive. Also collaborative is a big one. We've got about 50 respondents, but at least 100 attendees. Some other words coming up: opaque, respectful, cordial, limited. Some interesting smaller words as well. And of course, you know, everyone maybe has a different experience, which is helpful to get a fuller picture here. We'll close this down in 10, 9, 8, 7, 6, 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Why don't we pause it there? But this is helpful, and it was a great test run. We're going to have a full survey at the end of the conversation. But we appreciate folks commenting, and I see there are also some comments in the chat on Zoom. And I also see the note from Heather that we are now live on Facebook. So we're glad folks who are joining us on Facebook are with us. Okay, Matt, you want to get the conversation started with our experts?
Sure, you bet. Thank you all once again. And let me remind you, there'll be an opportunity for question and answers following each of our guest presenters. But also, you also have the opportunity to give a question or two after each presenter's respective presentation. Our first presenter panelist is Professor Brian Williams from the University of Virginia. He's an expert on policing. Professor Williams?
Good evening. Thank you so very much. Heather, if you wouldn't mind putting up my slides, please. I've been asked to provide a historical overview of policing in the United States, and it's my pleasure to do so. Next slide, please. I'm an associate professor within the Baton School of Leadership and Public Policy. I'm an applied researcher who deals a lot with public engagement and governance as it relates to reimagining and redesigning police policies and practices. So I'm pretty passionate about the co-creation and co-production of public safety, public order, and community well-being. And I'm a major proponent of power with and not power over. So I really embrace this notion of this shared sense of responsibility. Next slide, please. In terms of a historical overview, I will focus my comments exclusively on policing, not Sheriff's Department, not federal agencies. And when you think about policing within the US context, it really began as an informal kind of volunteer kind of operation, where there was like a night watch system. The first night watch system started in Boston in 1636, followed up by New York City in 1658, and in Philadelphia in 1700. But as our society kind of evolved, so did this system evolve from night watches to day watches. So in 1833, Philadelphia had its first day watch. In 1844, New York followed suit. From those informal beginnings, we had these formal establishments where police departments emerged. So in 1838, Boston established the first US police force, followed by New York City in 1845, Albany, New York, and Chicago in 1851, New Orleans, Louisiana, and Cincinnati in 1853, and by 1855 in Philadelphia. But by 1880s, police departments had been established in all major cities. Next slide, please. When we think about policing, we have to think about the funding mechanism for it. And initially, the financial support was from private dollars, but over time it grew into public dollars. And as a result, we saw an evolution in terms of how police departments kind of operated. This is my own analysis of it, as well as some analysis from other police scholars. So we see an evolution from political puppets. What I mean by that, they were kind of beholden to those private interests, to professional actors. And this is over time where they became much more established, much more professional in their orientation. But when we think about this evolution, from the start, the colonial days, up until, let's say, the 1880s and early 1900s, there was some common ground that they all shared. They were enforcers of laws. And oftentimes these laws really impacted targeted populations who had these social constructions that kind of created a narrative about them. These populations were stigmatized. So I have a bullet here that's kind of bolded and italicized that highlights how public perceptions led to social constructions that led to political constructions or laws or policies that impacted policing and professional practices that once again reinforce public perceptions. And we can kind of see that cycle repeating. But one common ground that we have to really appreciate is policing has an orientation to support the status quo. So they traditionally, we can kind of look at them as being supporters of the status quo. Next slide, please. So another common ground that we can appreciate is that policing as a way to protect profits. And this is where it kind of complicates things a bit. In this protection of profits, there were some regional differences. In the Northeast, in cities like Boston, of course, shipping interest. So they were protecting shipping interest. In industrial areas like the Midwest or the Northeast, industrial kind of interest. So oftentimes there were strike breakers or strike busters. But in the South, in the colonial South, antebellum South, primarily slave patrols were the precursors of police departments and law enforcement organizations. And what we see in this context that's so pertinent to our discussion today is there was protection of profits at the expense of people. Next slide. So I have before you a visual depiction where we have these early days of policing being somewhat reactive, political, and informal. And then as they were much more established, it became proactive, professional, and formal. Next slide. So the question I have, and I think this will be one of the questions that we will kind of talk a little bit about, will our past service prologue? And we see two badges, the old slave patrol badge to my left and the much more modern kind of contemporary deputy sheriff's badge to my right. Next slide. Or should we look back to plan ahead? And what I have before you is the 7th principle of Sir Robert Peel of the Metropolitan London Police Department. And in 1829, he wrote, "The police at all times should maintain a relationship with the public that gives reality to the historic tradition that the police are the public and the public are the police." Next slide. So this forces us to kind of think about another question. Should we embrace and leverage this coactive moment and movement that we're now in to go from being reactive, political puppets, informal kind of organizations to proactive, professional, extremely formal organizations, or coactive, community-oriented, communal organizations that really reflect public expectation as well as professional kind of expectation of designing policies, practices, and programs. Next slide. These are my sources. Feel free. I guess you guys could also share this with others. And with that being said, I'd just like on my next slide, just say thank you for this opportunity. I look forward to answering any questions that you may have. And you're more than welcome to get in contact with me via email. Thank you. Great,
great. Thank you, Professor. There were just a couple of questions. One of the first questions was, there were day watching. What were day watching for and night watching for? To be more direct with your information, were they slave catchers or something else?
In terms of the northeastern kind of cities, just kind of protecting those profits. So it's just like what a cop is doing today, watching the beat, making sure everything is okay. Of course, at night, things happen at night. So the need for night watches was in response to some criminal activity. But when we applied in the regions, of course, slave patrols patrolled night and day. They were, guarding the profits of those folks who enslaved people. So they were pretty active in their patrol kind of mechanisms.
Great. And just one more question, and then I've just got a comment. I've seen some folks argue that policing has its roots in slavery. What do you think about this? That's a question from the audience.
It's regional in the South for sure. We think about in South Carolina. I think in the Carolinas, 1704 was the first slave patrol that emerged. So that predated a whole bunch of police departments. But it was all about enforcing the law. So we can kind of see those slave patrols as being precursors to police departments. So we can kind of see some parallels, some when we think about like stop and frisk kind of things too, past kind of impacting the present somewhat. But there were regional differences.
Great. And let me just say all the slides will be made available to the public. I'm going to sneak in one more question and that will be it. And this question is, when did women become police officers?
That is something I cannot, off the top of my head, kind of get that information, but I'd be more than happy to kind of forward that with you, get that to you to forward out to those in the audience.
Very good. Very good. And again, thank you so much for your time. We greatly appreciate it. And you've added a wealth of information to this conversation.
Thank you so very much.
Chris?
All right, Professor. And the professor's going to stick around for the conversation. So, so if you have more questions for him, or as we go along, please continue to place your questions into Slido, and we will use them for the broader conversation. But with that, we're going to turn to our next expert. So where the professor is here giving us a lot of historical context on policing, we've got Linda Garcia with us from the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. And Linda is the Policing Campaign Director at the Leadership Conference. And we're very lucky to have her with us because she is working at the national level with local communities to help folks wrestle with and talk about reforms in policing, and has a number of resources at her disposal at the Leadership Conference. And so we wanted to get her take on the national conversation right now, and to level set some of the concepts that we're hearing in the national debate. So Linda, I'm going to turn it over to you.
Hello, good evening. First of all, thank you for having me. It's a real honor to have this opportunity to speak here tonight. As Chris said, my name is Linda Garcia, the Policing Campaign Director at the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights. We are a coalition organization of more than 220 civil rights organizations as members, and we work nationally really to make sure that every person's human and civil rights are respected in this country. So in March of 2019, the Leadership Conference launched our new Era of Public Safety initiative, and the initiative really looks to promote 21st century best practices, but that are community-led reform, so really that are centered on community needs, community interests, community solutions. Within that report, we make over 400 recommendations on a wide variety of topics, everything from bias, discriminatory policing to use of force, stop and frisk, accountability, data collection. With it, we have an accompanying toolkit that is designed for community advocates, and that is really a how-to. This is, I want to start a campaign, I want to do policing reform in my local, in my town, my city, how do I do this? And so that's a resource, and I'll share those at the end. But so I'm going to talk about some of the concepts and the reforms that people are talking a lot about right now and set the framework, because I will say there's a lot out there in the media among advocates, and honestly it's confusing, and especially when we start to talk about defunding the police. Next slide. So what is defunding the police? Building on a little bit of what Dr. Williams said, for so much of U.S. history, police have just been the entity that implement laws, right? They enforce the laws, but explicitly most laws, when you think about it, have been designed to subjugate Black people and enforce white supremacy and maintain those structures of racism. In addition to the slave patrols, which we've already talked about tonight, it's police that enforce the Black codes and the Jim Crow laws after that, and segregation and broken windows policing and stop and frisk. And we're watching them use weapons of war right now in our cities against protesters. So it's under this under this context that the current calls for defunding are asking city, state, and federal governments to radically reimagine policing as we currently understand it, and for the complete divestment from excessive, brutal, and discriminatory policing. Many of the advocates, therefore, it's a rejection of any proposed expansions of police budgets. And that means more officers or more trainings or more equipment, anything that really furthers or supports the institution of police. And instead, what activists are really looking for and what the ask is for elected officials to invest in a new vision of community safety that actually works for everybody, not just a select few, right? Not just the elite or white or wealthy communities. And so it's really about making pivotal changes in our national priorities. It's about saying communities to keeping them safe through a massive investment in community programs and services. So that would mean investments in things such as education, local restorative justice services, employment programs. But coupled with that, you also have to decriminalize a lot of the things that we have defined as crimes, really. And these, run anything from drug-related offenses to offenses of survival. If you look at folks like Eric Gardner, who was supposedly selling cigarettes, or Alton Sterling selling CDs. Walter Scott had a broken taillight. George Floyd purportedly, had used a counterfeit $20 bill. All these things are minor issues that do not actually implicate public safety and can better be addressed through other means. And in a large call for this, and we hear it a lot, and I will say we hear this a lot from the law enforcement community, is improved mental health services, housing, and school counselors and psychologists. And this is in large part because we see so many incidents of use of force and excessive force and officer-involved shootings stem from officers responding to people in mental health crisis. And this is because we just have a fundamental lack of those services in this country. Officers do not want to be addressing issues of people who are unhoused, and officers shouldn't be in schools disciplining children for what are age-appropriate behaviors. So to this end, there are models out there that cities, as they take on these efforts, can start to look to. One pretty famous one and well-known one is Cahoots in Eugene, Oregon, which is a non-police affiliated service, an organization that calls to police for folks in mental health crises are diverted to. And so they're the ones that show up. Police don't even get involved in those calls. Berkeley, California, we recently saw last week, is now working to remove police from traffic stop enforcement and replacing police with unarmed civilians. Minneapolis, a city where we did see George Floyd's murder, did have a very innovative program there that was a fix-it warning program for folks with equipment violations, and where they received a voucher to go, for example, get their tail light fixed. So this is the right path when folks are talking about defunding. Let's put our money in the right places, things that actually can help the underlying social issues. Because when you send an officer who's been trained to use a gun to calm a person in crisis, for example, they're going to use the gun. So this is this is really what the defund movement is going towards. But it does acknowledge that there is not going to be an immediate elimination of all law enforcement, but that it has to be a very thoughtful, participatory process. Next slide. When we get to defunding the police, abolishing the police, it's part and parcel of that movement. And abolishment does look for the complete eradication of the criminal legal system at large and police also. So it's premised on the same principles that these institutions were built on white supremacy and racism, and therefore inherently cannot be fixed. So this raises the question and the belief that reforms don't work. We've been trying to reform police for decades, yet it hasn't changed violence against Black people or other marginalized communities. But to this end, I do want to address that a lot of people do believe in shrinking the footprint of police and that you can have reform at the same time. And I would say we've heard a lot of folks saying this in the last weeks, months, is that budgets are moral documents, right? So where you put your money is what speaks to your principles. And, I don't think that any family sitting around the kitchen table would say, let's spend half of our, budget this month on a security system, but we're not spending any on our health care. So, it's the same sort of thing, like how we are actually like creating what the social environment is that we're creating. So I'm gonna, if we go to the next slide, just talk about 3 reforms that do, I think, still complement this idea of shrinking the footprint of police while promoting accountability. The first being data collection. So data collection and reporting are really important steps towards transparency. It allows communities and departments to analyze the effects of policies, the practices, and change them if ultimately they're ineffective or proving to have a disparate impact on specific communities, Black people, marginalized communities. So it is imperative that police departments have accurate data to monitor these issues, because ultimately you cannot measure what you don't know. And so without this information, you just cannot start to implement the right changes and reforms. The Leadership Conference has urged all state and local governments and the federal government to mandate data collection and the reporting, and that should be on all law enforcement activities, including officer-involved shootings, use of force incidents, stops, searches, and arrest. The data should be disaggregated with demographic categories, including race, ethnicity, gender, disability, and importantly, it needs to be made publicly available. With regard to body-worn cameras, now this is a little bit of a trickier situation because we are talking in some instances about putting more money towards equipment technologies, and a lot of folks don't want to see that right now. But there are ways to do this without necessarily spending more money if you're thoughtful about how the money that's already there is spent. Video footage in general has changed the playing field in police accountability, and body-worn cameras hold the same promise, yet they're not the panacea that reformers thought they were like 5 years ago in the aftermath of Michael Brown's murder, when there was another huge policing reform push. Without carefully crafted policies and safeguards, there is a real risk that body-worn cameras can be used in ways that threaten civil and constitutional rights, and that they intensify the disproportionate surveillance of communities of colors. So some of the best practices that jurisdictions need to think about when adopting body-worn cameras and policies is that there be a presumption of wrongdoing when officers fail to activate their cameras. Requiring random audits of footage so that police or officer misconduct can be identified. Policies that limit retention periods for footage, but that also preserve footage of incidents that in which there was a complaint, a citizen complaint. The release of video immediately following lethal incidents, and again, cannot emphasize enough the importance that all policies, and this really goes for all technologies, be developed hand in hand with community members. And that has to be a participatory process. And even in the adoption and considering adopting technologies, that should involve community members. Lastly, I won't speak too much about this because I know Mr. Brownfield is about to talk about community oversight boards, but I will note their importance. Many disciplinary matters often go under-addressed within police departments through those chain of command reviews, or we only learn of them once individuals have filed complaints. So review boards are a mechanism by which community members can be part of that accountability process. Importantly, they have to have real teeth, subpoena power, and the ability to review all sorts of incidents. So with that, I know my last slide, we offer some of the resources that the Leadership Conference has put out, the advocacy toolkit that I had mentioned at the outset, an issue briefing, and other community tools that we have provided in the hopes that they can provide folks with the mechanisms to pursue and make some real change.
Great. Thank you, Linda, for that presentation. We are getting a lot of questions, so maybe I'll throw a couple at you, but one that certainly has come up in the chats and in Slido is, are we going to talk about Alexandria specific? That's actually where we're going next. And also, folks asked in the questions about having grassroots speakers in Alexandria on our panel. And so, we do want folks, we've got all sorts of folks, over 100 folks attending. So if you have testimony or if you have thoughts on your experience with policing, please enter them in the Q&A, even as a comment in Slido. We'd love to share them and get reflections from our experts as we dive into these. But one question for you, Linda, that jumped up. There was a really interesting one where folks were citing statistics in Alexandria around the numbers on who is getting arrested or who's getting, having police interactions. Certainly there were numbers that were released in the newspaper locally, and you may not have seen them, but a few weeks ago about just disproportionate interactions with people of color. In the chat, the question talked about 50% of arrests or interactions with black folk are with black folks, 24% with Hispanic. I know the number I saw in the local Alexandria Gazette was something probably around 53 or 54% of our use of force were with African Americans. So you're seeing similar numbers reported. Can you talk a bit about whether or not these sorts of numbers reflect the actual incidence of crime, or what does the idea of disproportionate arrest or disproportionate use of force look like nationally before we really zero in on Alexandria?
Sure. I mean, look, first of all, I'll say that those disparities exist across the country, and they exist in at every step of the criminal legal system, right? So if you're looking at stops, you're looking at arrest, uses of force, prosecutions, sentences, so it goes across the board. In terms of, I think, I mentioned a little bit about the decriminalization. I mean, so many laws have been designed, especially quality of life offenses, and those smaller, low-level offenses that so often are used just as honestly a pretext to be able to interact with people of color, right? And this is where you get into the racial profiling question. That is very hard to prove up, but I mean, police are legally entitled to use a driving offense as a pretext, right? And so the more interactions that you see, the more opportunity for those interactions, the more interactions you are going to see, whether it's implicit or explicit bias that's at work here. And obviously, the more interactions that people of color have with police, the larger the numbers of uses of force that are going to be used against them. So I think this is why a lot of the conversation is about reducing offenses, ordinances to really take away all these opportunities for interactions and, addressing those issues in a different way, with better services or, I mean, even just if you, traffic enforcement was by unarmed civilians, you would see a huge reduction in police interactions and uses of force.
Mm-hmm. And Linda, another one, we also have folks talking about gun control in the Slido chat, which you may see. And some folks are challenging when you said something to the effect of, if a police brings their gun, they're going to use their gun. Mm-hmm. About what you mean by that. I think that kind of controversial to some folks.
Sure. I can think there are many instances when folks have been in mental health crisis and police show up and they are very quick to use force to address that situation. Where if it had been social workers, mental health professionals that had addressed it, folks that are number one, can identify behaviors that police might actually find threatening or unusual. And so they are better suited for that. I think when folks talk about the gun control piece, I mean, there will be violent crimes, there will be gun violence crimes. And, I think that a large part of the conversation is figuring out how we address that and the role that police should play there. But I will say that, gun violence so often has been used as the justification for flooding communities of color with police to the point where they are like an oppressive force and enforcing, low-level offenses. And you know, in this supposed in order to fight crime, right, quote unquote crime. And so there is a real issue there. And so a lot, I think, of what the defund movement and the reform movement is talking about is gun violence intervention programs, interruption programs that can actually start to address gun violence without kind of this misguided approach of, you know, broken windows, quality of life enforcement.
And one last question, Linda, just because there's a lot of discussion about the comment on guns. Are you, I guess one way to put it is, because there's some testimony in here about, you know, the importance of police being able to respond to violent acts, criminal acts, that if they aren't there, then who will? What do you have thoughts on, or do you put out recommendations around, you know, police use of guns, use of force, when that's appropriate, and or are you saying that they shouldn't be available because there's stories in here that people are entering about where police came and saved the day because they had the ability to use guns? So how do you approach you know, those decisions made by police officers? Is it training? What are we talking about here?
Look, I mean, I think without a doubt there are you know, instances of violence when I mean, right, police can legally use force, and when, you know, it's every incident and the circumstances may, you know, are what dictate whether or not it was appropriate. I think, you know, the thing is this: we're at this like cross points, right? This crossroads moment where there's a real opportunity to like reimagine what public safety looks like at large. And that's why I think so much of the conversation is about, well, how can we rethink these things, and what, let's really think about what the role of police in, and that is part of it. So if communities decide we still want to have police, you know, respond to situations that involve intimate partner violence, or, you know, other things that carry with them an actual, like, you know, violence and danger, then that is part of that conversation. But that's really what folks are trying to work through right now. I would certainly, you know, suggest that if someone's in mental health crisis, or some family member really, you know, their son is having, you know, a crisis, they can only call police right now, right? And those things don't turn out well. You look at Antonio Legrier in Chicago, whose mother called in desperation, and they, you know, the police ended up killing him and the neighbor when she answered the door. And so I think there's certainly places where we can, you know, start to think of the alternative services, right? And if his mother had had another phone number to call, that might have turned out very differently. And I think there's a lot of different places that we can start to do that work.
Great. Well, we've taken up a lot of time. Stick around, Linda. We've got one more expert who's going to help us drill down into what's actually being discussed in Alexandria. Matt?
Great. Thank you very much, Chris, and thank you, Linda. Our next presenter is Burke Braunfeld. He'll be speaking more locally about Alexandria and community review boards in general. And I want to remind everybody that we'll take a couple of questions specifically for Burke at the end of his presentation, and then we're going to open it up for all of your questions for each of the panelists. Thank you. Burke? And Burke, you're on mute.
Thanks, Matt.
Yep.
Okay, great, thanks. Just FYI, having internet issues, just wave your hands if you can't hear me, and I'll switch to my phone. Thank you.
You're doing well.
Thank you, everyone. So during the introduction, as you all know, I served as an Alexandria police officer earlier in my career from 2004 to 2010. I'm born and raised in Alexandria. Had a wonderful experience at the Alexandria Police Department, and since then I've gone into a few different arenas. More recently helped produce a film called Charm City, which is a documentary that focused on police-community relationships in Baltimore. In the Alexandria context, I worked quite a bit on the Band of Box program several years ago, and more recently worked at the Metro Transit Police as a civilian commander. So I've been in and out of policing over the last 15 years or so. And I think as I see some of the comments in Slido and things like that, one important reminder for us before we dive into the resolution 2950 that was passed by City Council in June that does talk about civilian review boards and other initiatives around public safety. I think it's really important to pull back and give context on a very local level here, right? Because one of the challenges in US policing is, what I always say is there's really no such thing as American policing. There's 18,000 different versions of policing in the United States. It's a hyper-localized service. There's a lot of inefficiencies as a result of that, and a lot of variance in quality of what you see across the country. So in order for us to really think about what do we want, as a city of Alexandria, for me, I try to remain a bit agnostic on what do we want, because ultimately I think it's up to the community. The community should decide what the community wants the new version of the police to be ultimately. And I think that's good for any organization, right? And we think about, I like to use the example of McDonald's. McDonald's 20 years ago, you couldn't order a single healthy thing on the menu, right? The customer base just didn't demand it. Well, times changed, things evolved, people's tastes changed, people's preference changed, people started to demand things like organic food, healthier food, salads, things like that. And McDonald's just changed, right? So I think policing, that's where we are to a certain extent as well, is we're at a point where there's a voice within the community that's saying, hey, we want a new version of this. And so I think it's actually an exciting time to listen, and police should be at the table, of course, as well, because they're key stakeholders in this discussion. So let's talk about Alexandria basics. Many of you probably know this, and some of you might not. So Alexandria Police Department has about 320 police officers. About 138 are civilian employees, which means they aren't carrying a gun and a badge. So it's 320 plus 138. Alexandria's population is about 160,000 people. And then some basic facts about Alexandria for calls of service for 2019. That means when someone has picked up the phone and called for the police to come, right? That was 80,928 calls for service. Pretty similar to 2018. That's about kind of a normal amount. Then also persons arrested in 2019 in the city of Alexandria, 4,316. Basically the same, it's very similar to 2018, kind of a very similar number, okay? So just for people to have context of what we're talking about here within the city of Alexandria itself. Now, again, before I get into what does a civilian review board look like, what is it, et cetera, again, laying the foundation of giving some context to what the city of Alexandria currently has in place versus where do we want to go. So the police department itself has an office called the Office of External Affairs and Professional Responsibility. Didn't used to be called that when I was there, but it's essentially the internal affairs department of the police department, for those of you who are familiar with that terminology, okay? So through that office, complaints can be reported online, in person, over the phone, et cetera. So if you're a citizen and you have a complaint about the way you were treated by the police department, that would be the office, as of today, that's how you would report that problem or complaint to the police department. So some basic data around that for people to be aware of. Internal investigation, again, and this is all actually available on the Alexandria Police Department's website if you kind of dig around. So in 2019, the Alexandria Police completed 91 internal investigations. So to give context to that, what do we mean by an internal investigation? Well, an internal investigation can be a variety of things. Internal investigation doesn't necessarily, that's different than, say, a use of force investigation. We're talking about things that can be overlap, et cetera. But internal investigation could also be just someone who maybe has violated a departmental policy and now the police department is investigating. It could be generated from a citizen complaint where the officer was rude and discourteous and it rose to the level that an internal investigation needed to be involved. It doesn't necessarily involve force. So there were 91 of those handled. In 2019, there were 19 citizen complaints handled. So 19 instances in 2019 of people calling in where the police department initiated a formal citizen complaint. Okay, now, again, just to provide some background, use of force. So the police department, it's important to understand this, and I'm a big proponent of some really fun ideas around the future of policing, but it all starts with kind of understanding what it is today. Like, how does this work, right? For me, it's incumbent on all of us who maybe are seeking some changes to really understand the nitty-gritty of the details of how it works as of today. So 2019 use of force is governed by what the police department calls directives. Directives are basically like standard operating procedures that govern many, many behaviors of a police officer. So one of them is a use of force directive. That use of force directive outlines kind of what you're allowed to do in certain circumstances, what kind of weapons you can use. And so the police department has a responsibility of investigating uses of force under certain parameters when they occur. And I'm talking about in the context of the way the rules are written as of today. There were 45 use of force cases in 2019 for the Alexandria police. That involved 37 officers. The reason it's not the same number is the way use of force is reported now is sometimes the same officer might have used two different types of force in the same situation. So they started with spraying someone with pepper spray, and then they hit them with a baton or something like that. That might have counted as two types of use of force, but the same officer. That involved 28 different citizens. So of all those cases, 28 citizens are involved. Within that, 15 of those were Black males or females. And then if you look at the broader numbers, 1 out of 154 arrests involved a use of force case. Okay, so that's just to understand the numbers here. Most of the officers that were involved in use of force incidents were patrol officers, which makes a lot of sense because those are the officers that are responding to most of the 911 calls or engaging with people at all hours of the night, sort of proactively driving around. Like, that's sort of the nature of their job would put them in a more likely scenario to be in a use of force incident. In 2019, as far as I could tell, none of the use of force investigations were found to be considered excessive force. Okay, and before I jump in to the actual resolution, just so everyone understands the types of force that were used in Alexandria in 2019. I think this is really important because if people are eager to have a civilian review board that takes a look at force, we should understand what force we're looking at, right? So there were 2 firearm incidents, and when I say that, it actually means it was 1 shooting incident with 2 officers that shot their firearms. So it was 1 incident, but it counts as 2 because it was 2 different police officers that shot in the same situation. So essentially 1 incident that involved shooting a gun, 0 times of using a baton, 3 times with a canine dog bite, 12 taser uses, and 3 pepper spray called OC spray, but commonly we would call that the pepper spray, 3 incidents of that, and 25 incidents of weaponless force. And so when we say weaponless force, it's kind of a catch-all. That could mean something like the police officer punched someone in the face and broke their nose. They needed to go to the hospital or be treated by EMTs, that sort of thing, or took them to the ground and they broke their ankle in the process. That would be weaponless force that rose to the occasion of being considered like a use of force in this case. All right, so now you have the context of what we're talking about in Alexandria. That's sort of the numbers as of today. And again, those are reported. The use of force obviously is normally going to be reported self-initiated by the police officer who used the force. Conversely, it could be reported through a civilian complaint in the event that the officer had not reported it, right? So a civilian might call in and say, hey, this officer punched me in the face, but there's no report of it, right? So then obviously the police will have to dig in to see what happened there, right? Now the resolution itself, the resolution 2950, now this is in the wake of George Floyd's death, and essentially it highlights the fact that recent deaths across the country have sort of brought to the attention this issue of systemic racism, not only in policing, but in a variety of different elements of our livelihoods in the United States, the electoral process, employment, education, housing, etc. Right? So it's not just the police that are being sort of called out in this context. Some specific reforms that the City Council is talking about in this resolution are the following. Tracking of demographic data with regard to police interactions. This is kind of an elusive piece of data that's a little tricky, right? So we know there's certain elements where we know the demographics really easily, like use of force. We know who force was used against. What's a little bit harder to capture, and most police departments aren't very good at it, is tracking with the fine-tooth comb all of the interactions that police officers have with people, right? So you pull over your car and you stop someone at 3 in the morning and you just chat with them for a few minutes, or you say, hey, stop, come over here. That's going to be recorded differently in different formats depending on the police department that you work for. Adopting a police body-worn camera policy. So as of right now, or up until now, this has not been a policy that the Alexandria Police Department has used. And that's not necessarily to blame the police department itself. It's just the city government up until this point hasn't pursued body cameras formally. It seems like perhaps that will be the case moving forward. And then City Council is committed to exploring new 21st century public safety models. This might go a little bit to what Linda Garcia was referring to, some kind of alternative methods for responding to calls for service, say calls for service that might now get routed to the police, perhaps. And we've seen another resolution come through more recently that's talked a little bit about this, perhaps with mental health cases, et cetera. Maybe someone else would respond. That has to be fleshed out, obviously, the logistics around it. And then finally, it says the City Council of the City of Alexandria hereby establishes a community police review board within 90 days of the passing of this resolution. And the city manager and the city attorney are directed to return to council in the first legislative meeting of September with a proposal to establish the community police review board. So let's jump right into that. Okay, so it sounds like pretty soon we're going to hear from city management what this might look like, okay? Civilian oversight of police. Linda Garcia has it's touched on it already, but basically the concept isn't brand new. However, it's relatively novel in the sense that we do have 18,000 police agencies, but we only have about 200 of these civilian oversight boards. So it's not a really common practice right now. It is relatively common in some other countries though. So it's always worth looking at other nations to see what they do. In the United Kingdom, there's a very strong independent police oversight agency that actually provides this oversight of policing on a national level. So they're looking at use of force cases, civilian complaints, et cetera. This came up more recently. For those of you who remember, after Ferguson and Eric Garner, the President's Task Force on 21st Century Policing put out a report in May of 2015, and they themselves list community oversight of police as a recommendation. And they basically say, to quote in one of the recommendations, some form of civilian oversight of law enforcement is important in order to strengthen trust with the community. Every community should define the appropriate form and structure of civilian oversight to meet the needs of that community. So this is an important point here in that Jim Birch from the National Police Foundation recently said this on a web chat that he has. And he basically said, the issue with community police oversight is if you've seen one version, you've only seen one version. So the challenge with this is there's really very little research on this. And there's also really not many best practices that have been identified that have been rigorously tested. Now, it doesn't mean that it's not a worthwhile pursuit, but what it means is that there's not a direct best practice that we could just look in a book and say, oh, well, therefore Alexandria should do this. It ultimately is very, very context specific. The city or the county that is pursuing it has to really do their own needs assessment and decide for that city or county, what exactly do they expect of this body or board or panel to be? Because it's not a one-size-fits-all solution. And so the best resource for anyone who's interested in reading more about this, it's called NACOL, which is National Association for Civilian Oversight of Law Enforcement. They're really kind of the number one body that provides research and information about these concepts. So I'll run right through this. Why? What is the purpose of something like civilian oversight? And according to NACOL, the goal is that it would increase police accountability. It would help to manage risks by, the hope would be to reduce the chances of things like lawsuits or unnecessary injuries or deaths in a given city or county. The goal would be to increase public confidence in police through independence and transparency. Another goal would be to build bridges between the police and the community. And sometimes we see that in review boards where they'll hold, the review board itself will hold community forums or events about controversial topics or controversial incidents. So then the next question is, so that's kind of the goal. That's why many cities want these boards. Then what do you need for it to be effective? Well, again, like I said, there's not a lot of research, but there's a lot of studies that show what hasn't worked. So by default, we can kind of see what's needed to even have a chance of it working. Number one is independence from the police department. That's kind of a given. We've seen failures across the board where civilian review boards have been too tightly tied or maybe report to the police chief. Doesn't work. Funding. And if you're going to do this, it has to be funded properly. So with no funding at all, usually it's a failure. And then there has to be access to the necessary records and data in order to actually provide legitimate evaluation of what you're looking at, which is often looking at civilian complaints, reviewing perhaps use of force investigations, and studying trends within the police department, data trends. And then of course, tailored to that specific community's needs. So what I'd like to leave you all with is a couple of different models that do exist. And my job is not to tell you what model you should take. I'm simply trying to provide the information of what the models are that are out there. So there's three basic models that are generally out there, and then there's mishmashes of those models. Number one is an investigative model. That's where there's a board of people, often they're actually paid employees. So the city or county has to budget for a paid employee that sits on this board or body, and they conduct full-fledged investigations based on civilian complaints, and they are totally independent of the police department. And again, that requires full-time staff and budget. An example of this would be like in Berkeley, California, or even Washington, DC. Washington, DC has 12 full-time investigators that actually investigate complaints. Then you have review focused. Review focused is usually more similar to like what we have in city commissions in the city of Alexandria, usually volunteers, often appointed by city council. And then what they might do is hold public forums about controversial policing issues. They might discuss training or policy priorities for the police department. And they might review civilian complaints or use of force investigations, but they wouldn't actually perform investigations. They might just sort of be an extra set of eyes looking at an investigation to review it. Then the third model is sort of like the auditor model. This is what Fairfax County has. Fairfax County has an independent police auditor as well as a sort of board of citizens, and they sort of interact with each other. This person often also doesn't necessarily investigate per se. However, they're directly involved in sort of the processing and maybe act as a clearinghouse for citizen complaints so that they can track all the citizen complaints. And then conversely, they can also be part of use of force investigations from the moment they're initiated, like serious ones, say a shooting, where they might not do the investigation, but they might be sort of side by side with the police as they're doing the investigation. And then there's a mishmash of those things all across the country where people don't necessarily choose one of those buckets, but they mix it up. And so, as I said, for context, locally, Fairfax County, they have the independent police auditor and a civilian police review panel. The auditor is a full-time professional position, paid. The panel is not. And they sort of are an intake for complaints from civilians, but they push those complaints to the police department for actual investigation. Charlottesville, a different example would be more of the review focused. They're appointed board of volunteers. They're not full-time staff. They don't do investigations, but they are set up to eventually, it's a new program, to eventually sort of be an intake for civilian complaints. And then again, as I mentioned before, you have the case like Berkeley, California, which is not local, but Washington, DC is, where there's a full-time staff, multiple staff members who are actually charged with performing investigations. So I leave you with that. and again, I don't view my job as to tell you what the city needs. I'd rather people seek the information out, educate themselves about what's out there, and provide a deeper sort of conduct your own assessment of what you think is the best fit for the community. And you may even be specific, right? So I am always of the opinion is educate as much as possible, and then make the decision.
Great. Thank you so much, Burke. We're running a little tight on time, so that we can get the most questions in from the audience here. We're going to go right to you all. So again, get your questions through Slido or Facebook. And Chris, would you like to lead off with the first question?
Sure, we've got a ton of them. Let's see. How about I start with this one, because there were a couple comments, including someone named Judy commented on her own experience with a disability and gave her own testimony about being transported in cuffs when police responded to a mental health concern. And others also asked how many use of force incidents in, I think the intention was in the city of Alexandria, involve people with disabilities, or do we even collect that data? So there's this topic of folks with disabilities and how police are interacting with them. I don't know if our panelists have thoughts on how to deal with that, or Burke, if you know anything about Alexandria specifically and its approach to dealing with disabled citizens.
Hey, Chris. Yeah, sorry. I'm so too far out of the Alexandria police game to be able to speak intelligently about the disability question. I know there is the crisis intervention team training, which I think 60% of officers have completed so far, which is probably mainly focused on the mental health question, which of course there's going to be crossover there potentially, but I don't know specifically about like physical disabilities.
Okay. Well, Linda, I don't know if you have any ideas.
Yeah, sure. I mean, I can say that the estimates are that nationally 25% of uses of force are, again, involve people with disabilities, and disabilities broadly meaning physical disabilities, mental health disabilities, you know, and so there are a lot of different ways to approach it. There is the co-responder CIT model, crisis intervention model, in which police officers are accompanied with, a social worker, a mental health professional to these sorts of calls. There are full models where police are just trained. There's crisis intervention teams embedded in the police departments or units. They are the ones who respond to mental health calls. And then what a lot of folks are calling for, which is moving towards non-police responses. And that can be in the, increasing mobile crisis units, 24-hour hotlines, peer-to-peer interventions. So there is a lot of space. Again, I think actually, like Burke had said, there's no prescription for any one place. I think right now is a moment for possibility and innovation and trying different things. But those are some of the different models.
Great. And, we can hear from Heather that we can also check in with our local police department about those sorts of statistics and get a fuller response from them to share on our Facebook page, on the Act Alexandria Facebook page in the future. So we did the best we can on that one. But thank you for the question, folks. Matt? Matt, you're muted. You got the next question, though?
Sorry again. This is a very broad topic we're dealing with today. We could do a whole series on mental health, school patrols, things like that. I would first encourage anybody to go to the Citizens Police Academy. It's a wonderful experience to just see how tough of a position police are in on a day-to-day basis. With that, I want to ask a question probably for either Brian or Burke, and that is, what are your views on modifying qualified immunity protection for police as a way to enhance accountability.
Burke, would you like to go first?
I don't care. You go ahead, Brian.
Can we get a definition of qualified immunity just so we're all on the same page?
Many see it as a shield, a way of protecting officers from, well, I'll kind of share with you based upon my research. It can create an accountability kind of problem. So I'm a proponent of trying to modify it. How best to modify it might be, up for discussion. In the research I've been doing with police executives as well as city managers, oftentimes what has happened, instead of providing more resources or pay for police officers, they've been provided more protection, which makes it a little harder for them to be held accountable from the perspective of a lot of police executives. So what happens is that a bad apple can spoil the barrel. There's the new line of research that kind of looks at these network science within policing. That's fascinating. That kind of looks at how some officers, as they kind of transfer into different units, they might bring some issues with them into those units and kind of contaminate those particular units. And I kind of see that in connection with this whole notion of, how do we go about modifying qualified immunity to kind of make sure that we address some of those issues that need to be addressed. But this is also very, very complicated too. Oftentimes we think about trauma within communities. There's a lot of trauma on the job too. And that's something I don't know if we are at a point in terms of providing resources to really help heal those officers who oftentimes are harmed by the service they do on the job. And that's a whole nother conversation we really need to have within communities to better appreciate the lived experience of our police officers when they have to kind of deal with some difficult situations.
Thank you. Chris?
Okay. Burke, you didn't want to get, you're good?
Oh yeah, no, I was just going to say, I think Dr. Williams did a good job. I think the point is, sorry, can you hear me?
Yes.
Okay. The point is with policing is the challenge that we often face with qualified immunity, and the issue around qualified immunity is that unfortunately for police officers, violence at some point enters into the nexus of their work on some level. And hopefully we can make it less than it is. But unfortunately, they've been tasked with a job that on some level we give them a gun, we give them baton, pepper spray, et cetera, and give them training. And so, it's a complicated world when people are empowered to go out and make decisions that involve force, physical force. But then at what point do you hold that person accountable legally versus, oh, you just didn't perform your job properly? And it's just complicated. It's a much deeper question, I think, than we could probably handle in this forum. And I'm not an expert on it, but it's something that we have to sort of think through, the fact that it's a unique job that requires some ugly things sometimes. And hopefully with some of the reforms we can come up with, hopefully we can reduce some of that ugliness. Unfortunately, there's a reason why we give police officers guns and weapons and those things. Sometimes there's options that are run out. So it's complicated. I would love to see some reform around it, though. I think that would be good for all of us, but I'm not sure the exact answer yet.
Okay. We did have a couple questions around the idea of reporting incidents. One was, what incentives do officers have to self-report? And how can civilians have or be given tools to report incidents that they're concerned about use of force or other interactions? Burke, you talked a bit about this, but are there other ideas out there to the full panel?
I can jump in. I mean, some of the, I mean, under or no reporting is an issue. I think this is why civilian complaint or community initiated complaints are important. Some things that departments have done and jurisdictions have done to facilitate this, because many times community members may fear retaliation or just that there might be negative consequences, is accepting anonymous complaints. Auditing of video footage, auditing of reports on a, on some sort of periodic timeline. But those are kind of like the accountability measures that you just have to have in place in order to hopefully identify those issues. This because many times community members may fear retaliation or just that there might be negative consequences, is accepting anonymous complaints.
You guys hear that?
Video footage.
That was an odd loop back. Thank you. Okay. And Burke, you highlighted in Alexandria there are some specific ways to report incidents.
Yes, so I think as of right now, you can report online, by phone, in person. Of course, there may be some people that, and of course, this is one of the points that comes, some people might not feel comfortable making that report back to the police department, right? So if you had a negative experience with the police, the first place you might not want to call might be the police. So that's sometimes why this idea of the civilian review boards come up, right, as giving a kind of another alternative for an avenue for reporting. But going back to your other question, Chris, about the incentive for self-reporting. Mm-hmm. So within the police department, of course, like the body-worn cameras, for example, that creates an auditing function, right? So you could effectively create some audits to ensure that people are reporting the way encounters actually happened. However, I could say that use of force, at least within the Alexandria Police Department, culturally is taken quite seriously, and it would be a real aberration to have used serious physical force in the city of Alexandria and neglect to say anything, right? So you're required to note it in a report, notify your supervisor, et cetera. Now, what this gets into other questions, like if you push someone, that's probably not going to count as a use of force, right? In the case of a policy. So these things get complicated, right? Because if you're a citizen who got pushed, in your mind, you might say that was force used against me, right? But then there's a question of what did the policy say and what was required from a reporting perspective in that regard. And that's where I think being open and transparent and communicating that information regularly with the city so that people really understand why there could be a mismatch of information in some people's eyes, like, hey, that number sounds low, I think it should be higher. That requires a lot of communication back and forth, I think.
Great. Matt, we probably have time for one more question if you've got one. I'm sorry, folks, that this takes so long. And also, Matt, you've been on the Human Rights Commission. The Human Rights Commission takes reports as well, correct?
So the Office of Human Rights takes reports, and quarterly the Human Rights Commission's executive board meets with the police on all instances of excessive use of force and biased policing. When there is a shooting or an excessive use of force at some point or another, we can hold public hearings, although the only limitation is that we do not have a de novo review of the police investigation. We get what the police give to us. So it's less than ideal. And to be honest, the commissioners, including myself, we're not experts in the field. So, we would probably, and I don't speak for the Human Rights Commission, but just for myself, probably prefer to defer that responsibility so that we can tackle other more traditional discriminatory practices within the city. Okay. So.
Did you find one more, Matt, that we can speak in?
There were some questions about militarization of the police forces and what role and necessity that it provides to police forces. I'd probably direct that to you, Linda.
Yeah, I mean, look, the Leadership Conference on Civil and Human Rights calls for the end of police militarization altogether. On the national federal level, we call for the end of 1033, the 1033 program, which is the program through which military equipment is transferred to local jurisdictions. I will say, you know, and I think, you know, folks might be of a different opinion, that generally weapons and that were designed for war zones don't belong on city streets. They tend to be used often in response to mass demonstrations. We saw that in Ferguson. We're seeing that play out across the country right now. And it's interesting, you know, and I don't know if there studies have been done on this, but generally, the thought is within the policing reform world is that it actually escalates, right? They escalate encounters because when folks are met with, you know, officers in camouflage or in tanks and, you know, with shields, that inherently sends a message that, you know, these are really negative encounters. So I guess that's what I would say. It is a really big problem. So we do call for the end of that.
Okay. And there's some comments there in the chat from, looks like from Professor Williams. But we are running out of time quickly. Thank you everyone for all your questions. I wish we had more time, and it sounds like we need to continue to have dialogue in the city around these ideas. But what we're going to do, the next interactive portion is our closing survey. So I'm going to hand it off to Heather Peeler from ACRA Alexandria to run us through those questions on Slido.
Great. Hi, everybody. Thank you so much to all of our panelists for a great discussion this evening. And thank you to all the attendees for your wonderful questions. And I'm hoping we can compile all the responses that we received on Slido and then also through the chat, and definitely make those available to our colleagues at the police department, on the city council, and so on, so that we have a documentation of the concerns and questions that you are raising. But as you can tell, the main focus of our conversation today is to get some input on the resolution that is before the city council. And so we have a few quick questions, poll questions to pose to you that we think would be beneficial for the City Council to take into consideration as they consider next steps. So I'm going to ask my colleague Sophia to tee up Slido. And if you're not already on Slido, you can go to slido.com, and hopefully everybody sees on their screen the first question here. But if you go to slido.com, #policing, if you click on the poll tab, you should see this first question. We want to know, what is the most important power that you think a community review board should have? So please select one answer here and let us know what you think the emphasis of the community review board should have. And I see lots of responses coming in. Thank you for sharing your perspectives. It looks like we put in all of the above, and that looks like that's getting the most votes so far. But if folks have perspectives on what you think will make the biggest difference, if it's the ability to collect and receive data, that's something we've talked quite a bit about, or the ability to conduct independent investigations, that's something that's come up as well. And so looks like we're slowing down in the responses, so I'll give everybody another 5 seconds if you haven't yet added your perspective. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Okay, thank you for your input. Next question, what is the ideal composition of the Community Review Board? Who do you think should be a part of this body? So again, this poll question should be appearing on the slido.com page. Let us know who you think should be members of the review board, whether it's folks who are reflective of the community. Perhaps we want them to have some expertise in social work or mental health services, or having direct experience with law enforcement, or perhaps people who have been the victims of biased policing, for them to have a vehicle or a way to influence oversight of the police. So we have about 45 responses. I'll give everybody just a few seconds here to put in your final thoughts. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Thank you. 50 responses. Great. Thanks, everybody. Our next question is about the process in developing the Community Review Board. What would you expect to see from City Council? How do you think you and other Alexandrians can be engaged? Would you like to review any plan before it's approved, or perhaps you want to see multiple forums for input? There are different ways the City Council can provide public transparency, or maybe you want to hear directly from the police department and Chief Brown about what their recommendations might be. So let us know what process you think should be followed as we work to operationalize the recommendation from the City Council. So I'll give folks another few seconds. I'll do the countdown again. 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. Thank you. And our final question here, you know, the review board is one thing, that the community board is one thing that we are considering, but we've tonight discussed a whole range of different types of reforms or new policies that should be a point of focus for our community. So let us know what you think should be considered next. Is it a closer look at the police budget in terms of balancing mental health and social services, or perhaps offering incentives for police officers to reside in Alexandria so they are closer to residents? Or maybe you want to see us move further along in thinking about what to fund the police might look like in Alexandria, or certainly looking at that intersection between policing and education. Great. Okay, well, thank you so much for these final comments. I'll just give everybody a couple of seconds. 3, 2, 1 to get in their last vote. So thank you. We will be sharing all of those comments with our colleagues, and appreciate your input on these questions. And so with that, I'm going to turn it back over to Matt and Chris for any closing remarks that you would like to make. And again, I just appreciate everybody's active participation this evening. Thank you.
Great. Thanks again, Heather. And thank you all from Act for Alexandria. There are just so many people behind the scenes who made this successful. And of course, our panelists, you've done an excellent job. I wish I had time to acknowledge everybody. Chris?
Yeah, we just appreciate everyone joining us. I look out my window, there's a hailstorm going on, but people took the time to join us this evening. We appreciate it. And we have some resources that we wanted to share, and hopefully we can keep sharing these on Facebook on the Act for Alexandria page. I don't know if we have that slide, but there's a number of places that people can go. My video is turned off. But there are a number of places people can go to learn more. Certainly, there's the resolution that we want folks to follow. We want folks to engage in the conversation. I know Councilwoman Amy Jackson was on. I just saw a comment from her. There may be other elected officials on. Please share your thoughts and ideas with your elected officials. Additionally, there's the resources from the Leadership Conference on Civil Human Rights. And there's information that we have for folks dealing with trauma as well. And that's very important, that if you've had race-based trauma, that you seek help. There are professionals in Alexandria who you can turn to. And so there's a link there. I think those are our resources. We want to keep doing this. Shared Voices is an ongoing community effort. So if you want to get involved, please contact. I would contact Heather Peeler or Jacqueline Tucker with the city, helping steer this, as well as Eric King. There's upcoming community events going on. There's one on race relations in Alexandria, looking back at the history of it, that Matt's going to be working with the Alexandria Libraries on. And so that's coming up on August 13th. Are there any others that we have on the list here?
I think you got them all. But do keep track of the city's calendar for upcoming events, and talk to your neighbors and in fellow members of the community. Thank you so much.
Matt, great working with you. Thank you to our speakers. Challenging topic, lots of interaction from the city. We appreciate it.
Take it easy, everybody.
Bye.
Good night.